This episode is Nicaea. In the last episode, we considered the theological innovations of Arius, whose views on the nature of Christ were declared heretical by the Council of Nicaea in 325. We return to that in this episode because of the impact the Nicene Council had on subsequent church history. That impact wasn't due solely to what the 318 bishops who gathered decided about what would constitute approved Orthodox Christian doctrine. That would be enough to mark the Nicene Council as historically significant. Equally important is the precedent that it set for how the church would handle controversy and challenge. Theological controversy had been a part of church history going back to the first century. Some of the New Testament letters were written specifically to deal with false teaching, while others deal with it tangentially. Until the 4th century, heresy was handled by church leaders doing the slow work of consistently teaching the truth, clarifying precisely what the Bible did say in regard to the challenges presented by aberrant teaching. Most of that work was done by individual bishops tending their flocks. When a false teaching spread across an area, church leaders of a region might meet to pool their work and decide on a course to take in pushing back against error. These regional gatherings to address doctrinal and practical matters of church life were called synods. Things changed with the official removal of persecution by Constantine in the Edict of Milan in 313. As we saw in the last episode, the Emperor Constantine didn't just take Jesus as his patron deity, he began showing notable favor to the church and Christians. He hoped that Christianity could unite the fractured realm. He expressed a desire that the faith would be the, quote, cement of the empire, unquote. Now, consolidating his power after the defeat of his last rival Licinius, Constantine was presented with a church that was itself now fracturing over the popular but controversial ideas of an Egyptian priest named Arius. Now, since we considered Arius's errant ideas on the nature of Christ in the last episode, we're going to skip that now. Suffice it to say that those ideas were popular among the common people, no less because Arius was clever at promoting them. Being in the cosmopolitan center of Alexandria, Egyptian church leaders weren't hip to his theological innovations and called a synod. Without much debate, they condemned Arius's teaching as heretical. Arius then appealed to a growing number of friends outside of his region. One of those was the conniving Bishop of Nicomedia, eastern capital of the Roman Empire before Constantinople. His name was Eusebius. Now, this is not the same as the early church historian who lived at the same time. The name means pious and was a fairly common name among the followers of Christ at that time. Motivated more by political ambition than concern for correct doctrine, Bishop Eusebius aimed to make Nicomedia a center of the faith in the East. He became an avid supporter of Arius, whose errant doctrine began spreading rapidly there. The emperor couldn't wait on the old process of slow deliberation to resolve the Aryan Controversy. Constantine needed the church to act as a unifying force yesterday, and so he stepped in to hurry the process along. He was just the first of many over the centuries who would do much the same. These rulers could not allow the mechanisms of their realm to be stymied by long religious controversies. And so they applied political authority to decide who was right and who should be silenced. What that meant is that eventually those involved in controversy bypassed trying to convince their opponents or church leaders. They went instead directly to the emperor or king, prince, electors, or whoever other title the ruler was wearing at that time. And it wasn't long before theological debate was replaced by political negotiation. All of this began with the Aryan Controversy and the council that the emperor called to address it. Moving to reunite church leaders fractured by Arius's ideas, Constantine dusted off something that he'd used a decade before, where church leaders gathered at Arles to deal with several issues of the church that they were wrestling with at that time, most notably what date to celebrate Resurrection Sunday, and the other big issue of the day, to settle once and for all the Donatist controversy. That is, what to do with church members who had recanted Christ during the persecutions under Diocletian. The biggest challenge in that controversy was what to do with church leaders who'd turned over sacred texts to the authorities and had left their place as leaders of God's flock just to avoid persecution. Besides the Donatists themselves, who rejected the ruling of the Aryan Council, the rest of the church accepted the council's findings as normative for the church. Constantine hoped that another council would effectively deal with the growing rift caused by Arius's ideas. His first appeal was to gather church leaders in 324 in the city of Ankara, modern-day Ankara, capital of Turkey. But the death of the bishop at the important church of Antioch in Syria shifted the attention of church leaders there. Opponents of Arius seized the moment to call for a meeting in Antioch where they could select a new bishop from their ranks and then follow it up with a united condemnation of Arius. They concluded this hurried meeting with an official statement that came to be called a creed, setting the precedent for what would be many more so-called official statements of the church. Now, Constantine was not pleased that upstart church leaders had hijacked his plans. He called for a new council the next year at Nicaea, not far from his headquarters at Nicomedia. His move to his new headquarters at Byzantium, soon to be remade into the glorious new capital of the East, Constantinople, that was a couple years away yet. Constantine wanted the gathering at Nicaea to be a collection of all church leaders, and so he offered to pay the travel expenses of any bishop that could make his way to Nicaea. The ancient record says that 318 made it, some coming from far-flung regions outside the borders of the empire. And for that reason alone, Nicaea is regarded as a major milestone in church history. It's reckoned as the first ecumenical council, meaning that it gathered leaders from most of the various branches of the faith. And here, think cultural and ethnic expressions of the church, not doctrinal branches. The emperor informed the bishops that he intended to attend the council himself, albeit only as a spectator. Wink, wink. The delegates couldn't miss the unspoken subtext of the emperor's presence at what was, strictly speaking, solely a matter of church business. He intended to see things progress along lines that he approved. Not a few of the bishops who attended bore in their bodies the evidence of their faithfulness to Christ, taken from their torture that they had endured under the Diocletian and Galerius persecutions. Now they were in Nicaea on the emperor's dime. Though many of them had never even seen each other, they knew one another's names from the correspondence that they'd kept up over the years. Now, as a pastor, I've been to quite a few pastors' conferences. It can be a moving experience to be among so many Christian leaders, but I can't begin to imagine what it was like for those bishops, most of whom had spent their entire lives and ministries never having been gathered with more than maybe just a couple of other leaders at a time. Now there were over 300 of them from all over the known world. The first church historian, Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, was there, and he describes the scene. He says this: "There were gathered the most distinguished ministers of God from the many churches in Europe, Africa, and Asia, a single house of prayer, as if enlarged by God. It sheltered Syrians and Cilicians, Phoenicians and Arabs, delegates from Palestine and from Egypt, Thebans and Libyans, together with those from Mesopotamia. There was also a Persian bishop, and a Scythian was not lacking. Pontus, Galatia, Pamphylia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Phrygia sent their most outstanding bishops, jointly with those from the remotest areas of Thrace, Macedonia, Achaia, and Epirus. Even from Spain, there was a man of great fame, one Hosius of Cordoba, who sat as a member of the Great Assembly. The bishop of the imperial city, and by this Eusebius meant Rome, could not attend due to his advanced age, but he was represented by his presbyters," unquote. While the Aryan controversy had drawn them to Nicaea, they took advantage of the landmark meeting to deal with a raft of pressing matters. They affirmed the decisions made at Arles a decade before about the readmission of the lapsed. They set a standard for how to ordain elders and bishops. They dealt with an emerging issue that would see later councils embroiled in fierce debate: which churches ought to take the lead over the various regions of the empire and beyond. They forbade church leaders moving from one location to another. Now, this had become something of a problem and related to the previous point. With the removal of persecution and the church rapidly moving into imperial favor, some churches pulled more political influence than others, either because they were historical centers of the faith or because they were located in an imperial center. Being the bishop of the church in one of the centers became a plum appointment that some sought after. By prohibiting transferring from one place to another, the council hoped to put a kibosh on unholy ambition. The rule was passed. Sadly, it was quickly ignored. Having settled these lesser issues, the bishops settled in to deal with the main reason for the council, dealing with the Aryan Controversy, which we dealt with in the last episode, but we'll reprise here in brief. Supporters of Arius were fewer in number than those against him, but some of those supporters were politically astute. Because Arius was not a bishop, he was not present at the council. Bishop Eusebius of Nicaea led the pro-Arian party. Again, this is not the church historian and bishop of Caesarea. But Eusebius of Nicaea, well, he's a prime example of the politically ambitious ladder climber that I just spoke of. The pro-Arians assumed the reason of their position had not been accepted by the others simply because it was misunderstood. They thought that if they could just have a chance to explain, surely the other bishops would agree. On the other side stood a relatively small group of anti-Arians who saw in it the seeds of destruction of the faith. But in the middle, well, was the vast majority of bishops who, for whatever reason, had not been drawn into the arguments of either side. They knew that there was a controversy brewing in Alexandria, but regarded it as an obscure disagreement over some of Origen's ideas. Why get worked up over the nature of God when Tertullian had already provided them a suitable description by saying that God was, quote, 3 persons and 1 substance, unquote. But the turning point in the council's deliberations came when Eusebius of Nicaea explained Arius' teachings. The reaction was the opposite of what he expected. Arius' view that Jesus Christ was merely a creation, that provoked the bishops' anger. They cried out, "Blasphemy! Liar! Heresy!" Eusebius could not finish. The ruckus drowned him out. Someone ripped the pages of his speech from his hand, tore them into shreds, and then stomped on them. The bishops had gone from disinterested to supercharged. Their earlier desire to negotiate and compromise was tossed out in favor of outright condemnation of what they now all regarded as a pernicious error. They set out to base their rejection of Arianism by reference to biblical passages. While they could indeed do so, they realized that there was just enough wiggle room to allow a clever manipulator to resurface the error that Arius had introduced. It was like closing a door but leaving a window open. They wanted to seal the entire house of faith. Their solution was to produce a creed that expressed the faith of the entire church in a way that froze out the Arian error. The process they followed to produce what's known as the Nicean Creed is not really clear. It seems that Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, and we're back here to the good Eusebius, set forth the statement of faith that was used in his church as the basis from which to produce the Nicean Creed. What was needed was more precise wording, though, about the nature of Christ. That's when Constantine, of all people, suggested the word homoousios be included in the creed, meaning that Jesus was of the same substance as the Father, not just a similar substance captured by the word homoousios. Now, hold on. Constantine suggested a highly technical and theological term? How did the emperor suddenly become a philosopher to suggest a highly charged and theologically significant term? It was no doubt supplied to him by his friend and advisor, Bishop Hosius of Cordoba. The assembled bishops agreed to adopt the creedal formula of Caesarea, but to beef it up with the verbiage that made clear their rejection of Arianism. The Nicean Creed remains the most universally accepted church creed. The earlier Apostles' Creed, while popular in the Western Latin churches, was never really adopted in the East, while the Nicean Creed is acknowledged both by the Western and Eastern churches. The bishops who gathered at Nicaea hoped that the creed that they produced would put an end to the Aryan controversy. Few of them, including Eusebius of Nicaea, refused to sign it. Those few who failed to sign were labeled as heretics, and they were deposed. Constantine then banished these deposed bishops. He likely intended only to avoid further unrest. But adding a civil sentence to an ecclesiastical had serious consequences. It established a precedent for the intervention of secular authority on behalf of orthodox doctrine, or at least what at that moment would be deemed as orthodox. And Nicaea didn't end the Aryan Controversy. Eusebius of Nicaea was a clever operator, showing his true stripes as more concerned for political position than faithfulness to the gospel. Eusebius wormed his way back into Constantine's favor. He was allowed to return to his seat in Nicomedia. With the emperor's summer residence there, Eusebius plied Constantine with a steady dose of pro-Arian pap. Constantine eventually gave in to the relentless pressure and eased the penalties that he'd placed on the Arians. Arius himself was recalled from exile, and the emperor ordered the bishop of Constantinople to restore him to communion. Contrary to modern conspiracy mongers who want to make Constantine a kind of ancient boogeyman who hijacked Christianity and the church, while Constantine did indeed attend the Council of Nicaea, he did not set its agenda. He did not overrule in church affairs. He didn't hand the assembled bishops a list of books that were going to be allowed in their Bibles, and he certainly didn't set Sunday as the official day of worship.